Welcome back to the Anatolian Peasants Farmers, where we explore nature's most extraordinary wonders. Now let me ask you something. What if I told you that right now, somewhere on this planet, a single family owns a piece of land so massive, so incomprehensibly vast, that you could drop the entire country of Israel onto it and still have room left over for another nation on top? What if I told you there are ranches out there where a cowboy can ride on horseback for 3 straight days and never once reach the fence line? Where a single property employs its own airstrip, its own school, its own hospital, because the nearest town is literally hundreds of miles away. This isn't a legend. This isn't the plot of a Western movie. This is happening right now on ranches so jaw-dropping in scale they make the biggest cities on Earth look like parking lots. We're talking about operations where a single morning's drive across the property burns an entire tank of gas. Where managers don't use maps, they use satellite systems because no paper map is big enough. Where herds of cattle number in the hundreds of thousands, roaming distances that would take you across multiple American states. And where the land itself, the sheer, raw, breathtaking acreage, dwarfs entire sovereign nations. So how did these ranches get so big? Who owns them? How do you even begin to manage land that size? And which one sits at the very top, the single largest ranch on the face of the earth? Get ready to zoom out. Way out. Because today we're crossing deserts, flying over outback plains, riding through Patagonian wilderness, and galloping across the American frontier. These are the 10 biggest ranches on Earth, and every single one of them is larger than an entire country. By the time we reach number 1, your jaw will be on the floor. And here's a promise. Number 3 on this list is owned by someone you almost certainly know. Stick around because that one will genuinely surprise you. Before we go further, hit the subscribe button now and join the Anatolian Peasants Farmers. If you care about growing smarter, healthier food without wasting time on methods that don't work, this channel is for you. Subscribe now so you don't miss what could completely transform how you garden. Let's ride. Now, before we count down these giants, let's make sure you truly understand what we're talking about. Because the word ranch carries a certain image in most people's minds. Maybe it's a red barn, a few horses, a couple hundred acres of green pasture with a rusted gate and a dirt road leading up to a farmhouse. That image, however charming, has absolutely nothing to do with what you are about to see. The ranches on this list operate on a scale that doesn't just stretch the imagination. It shatters it entirely. Let's put some numbers on the table, because numbers are the only language big enough to describe what's coming. The average American farm sits at around 445 acres. That's roughly the size of 335 football fields, which already sounds like a lot. But the smallest ranch on today's list is more than 1,000 times that size. Read that again. 1,000 times larger than the average American farm. And that's the smallest entry. By the time we reach number 1, we'll be dealing with a property so large that if you drove across it at highway speed, no stops, no sleep, windows down, foot flat on the accelerator, it would take you multiple days just to cross from one boundary fence to the other. If you could even find the fence. These are not farms. They are not even ranches in the traditional sense. They are sovereign-scale land empires, private territories so enormous that entire ecosystems exist within their boundaries. Mountain ranges, river systems, desert plains, ancient forests. In some cases, wildlife populations that rival those of national parks. All of it privately owned. All of it managed by a single operation. And here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. The people and organizations behind these ranches aren't ancient royal dynasties or mythical land barons of the distant past. Many of them are alive right now. Some are corporations. Some are conservation groups. Some are families, real families, who have passed this land down across generations, holding on to territory that governments have tried and failed to acquire. Consider this. The nation of Lebanon covers approximately 4,036 square miles. The nation of Cyprus, a fully recognized sovereign state and a member of the European Union, spans just 3,572 square miles. The tiny island nation of Trinidad and Tobago, 181 square miles. Every single ranch on today's countdown is larger than at least one of those countries. Several are larger than all 3 combined. Let that sink in. We are not talking about wealth in the traditional sense, private jets, luxury yachts, penthouses in Monaco. We are talking about something far more primal, far more staggering. We are talking about land, raw, boundless, ancient land, owned outright by individuals and companies who have built empires not in boardrooms or on stock exchanges, but acre by acre, fence post by fence post, generation by generation. And managing land at this scale? That's a world unto itself. The logistics alone are staggering enough to make your head spin. Imagine coordinating a workforce spread across a territory the size of a small nation. Imagine maintaining hundreds of miles of water pipeline in desert heat, or keeping livestock alive through a flash flood in terrain so remote the nearest mechanic is a 4-hour drive away. Imagine tracking a herd of 100,000 cattle, not in a paddock, not in a feedlot, but roaming freely across millions of open acres, guided only by GPS collar data streaming into a central operations room that looks more like NASA mission control than anything you'd expect on a cattle ranch. This is the reality of mega ranch management in the 21st century. It is equal parts cowboy tradition and cutting-edge technology. Equal parts raw grit and cold hard data science. The people who run these operations wake up every morning and manage challenges that most CEOs of Fortune 500 companies would find completely overwhelming. Water shortages, wildfire threats, disease outbreaks across herds spread over millions of acres, fencing failures in terrain that requires a helicopter just to inspect, climate shifts that can turn fertile grazing land into cracked desert within a single season. And yet, they endure, they adapt, they grow. Because these ranches aren't just surviving, they are thriving, producing beef, wool, and agricultural goods that feed millions of people, managing ecosystems that preserve biodiversity on a scale that rivals protected national parks, generating economic activity in regions so remote they would otherwise have no economy at all. Some of these operations are the single largest employer within hundreds of miles. The nearest school, the nearest medical clinic, the nearest functioning road. In some cases, these things exist only because the ranch put them there. This is what land at the absolute limit of human ambition looks like. And here's one more thing to keep in mind as we count down. These are not static relics of a colonial past. These ranches are evolving rapidly. Drone fleets are replacing horseback scouts. Artificial intelligence is optimizing grazing rotations that used to rely entirely on a foreman's gut instinct. Satellite mapping is identifying water sources that human eyes missed for a century. Renewable energy is powering remote outposts that used to burn through diesel around the clock. The mega ranch of the 21st century is not just a piece of land. It is a living, breathing, technologically sophisticated operation that sits at the intersection of history and the future. And you are about to meet the 10 most extraordinary examples of that intersection on the entire planet. So let's start the countdown. We begin our journey not in the American West, where most people expect to find the world's biggest ranches, but on the sun-scorched, rust-red plains of the Australian outback, where the land itself seems to go on forever, and the horizon never gets any closer, no matter how long you drive toward it. Meet Stevenson Ranch. Sprawling across approximately 11,000 square miles of remote South Australian wilderness, this is one of the largest privately held cattle properties on the continent, and one of the most isolated working ranches on the planet. To put that in perspective, 11,000 square miles is larger than the entire nation of Jamaica. Larger than Lebanon. You could place the country of Qatar inside its boundaries and still have thousands of square miles of open rangeland left over. It was established in the early days of Australian settlement, carved out of territory that most people at the time considered entirely uninhabitable. Too dry, too hot, too far from everything. The founders didn't see uninhabitable land. They saw possibility. They saw grass, however sparse. They saw space, however punishing. And they built something that has endured for generations. The ranch runs cattle across terrain so unforgiving that traditional fencing is almost impossible to maintain at full scale. Instead, operations rely on a combination of GPS tracking collars, motorbike scouts, and helicopter overflights that happen on a rotating schedule just to keep tabs on where the herds actually are on any given day. Water is the single most critical resource and the most fragile. A network of bores, tanks, and solar-powered pumps stretches across hundreds of miles of pipeline, all of it maintained by a small crew who know this land the way most people know their own backyard. The challenge here isn't just scale, it's survival. In a drought year, and drought years come more frequently now than they ever did before, the decisions made on this ranch determine whether tens of thousands of cattle live or die. That weight sits on the shoulders of a remarkably small team in one of the most remote corners of the inhabited world. It's not just a ranch. It's a test of human endurance at the edge of the earth. From the Australian outback, we cross the Pacific and land in the northeastern plains of China, a region most people associate with industry and manufacturing, not wide-open rangeland. But tucked into the fertile, frost-bitten plains of Heilongjiang province lies one of the most ambitious ranching and pastoral operations in the entire world. The Mudanjiang Combined Pastoral Zone is staggering in scope, stretching across millions of acres of black earth plains, the same extraordinarily fertile soil that makes this region the agricultural backbone of modern China. This operation manages livestock and grazing land on a scale that has no real parallel in Asia. What makes this entry unique isn't just size, it's the philosophy behind it. China, facing the dual pressure of a massive and growing population and a shrinking pool of arable land, made a deliberate decision decades ago to develop mega-scale pastoral zones in its northeastern frontier. The Mudanjiang region was at the center of that strategy. State investment poured into infrastructure, roads, pipelines, processing facilities, cold chain logistics networks, transforming what was once swampy, untamed wilderness into a precision-managed food production zone. Cattle and dairy operations here are run with a level of technological integration that would surprise even the most seasoned Western rancher. Automated feeding systems, real-time health monitoring via electronic ear tags, AI-assisted pasture rotation scheduling that adjusts grazing patterns based on live satellite imagery of grass density. These aren't experiments or pilot programs. They are the standard operating procedure of an operation feeding hundreds of millions of people. Critics have raised serious questions about the environmental footprint, the pressure on water tables, the loss of native wetland ecosystems, the carbon cost of industrial-scale livestock management in a climate as extreme as northeastern China's. Those are legitimate concerns that the operation continues to wrestle with. But the scale of what has been built here and the speed at which it was built is undeniable. This isn't just ranching. It's ranching as an instrument of national food security strategy. Back to Australia we go, because when it comes to ranches that defy comprehension, this continent simply refuses to be outdone. Anna Creek Station. The name alone carries a kind of legendary weight in the world of ranching, and it has earned every ounce of that legend. Spanning more than 6 million acres deep in South Australia, Anna Creek is the largest single cattle station in the world. Not in Australia, not in the Southern Hemisphere, in the entire world. If it were a country, it would be larger than Israel, larger than Kuwait, 4 times the size of Greater London. You could fit the entire nation of El Salvador inside its boundaries and still have room left over for a country the size of Trinidad. It was established in 1863, making it older than many of the nations we've compared it to, originally as a sheep station, before the brutal, unrelenting reality of the outback landscape made clear that cattle were far better suited to the terrain. The transition was slow. The learning curve was punishing. But the station endured. And endurance is really the defining word for Anna Creek. Because this is not an easy place to run anything. The landscape shifts from cracked clay pans to salt lakes to sparse mulga scrub, baking under temperatures that regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius in summer. Rain, when it comes violently, flooding creek beds that were bone dry the day before, cutting off entire sections of the property for days at a time. Managing Anna Creek requires helicopters for aerial mustering, drones for fence and water trough inspection, GPS collars on cattle, and a logistics operation that runs like a military campaign. Ranch hands can spend entire days, sunrise to sunset, traveling just to reach a single broken water pump. And fixing that pump might be the most important thing that happens on the property that week, because without it, hundreds of cattle in that sector have no water source within reach. Despite its mythic scale, Anna Creek is operated by a surprisingly lean team. The people who work here don't just do a job. They inhabit a world. They live on the station for weeks and months at a stretch, in quarters that feel like a remote outpost at the edge of civilization, because in many ways, that is exactly what they are. It's not just the world's largest cattle station, it's the last frontier. All right, let's stop the countdown for a moment. Because before we continue revealing the biggest ranches on Earth, before we get to the truly jaw-dropping numbers still waiting for you on this list, there is a conversation we need to have. A question that doesn't get asked often enough in videos like this one. A question that once you hear it, you won't be able to stop thinking about. How big is too big? We've spent the last several minutes marveling at scale, at helicopter musters and GPS collar systems and satellite-guided water pipelines stretching across millions of acres of open land. And those things are genuinely extraordinary. The human ingenuity behind operations of this size deserves real respect and real acknowledgement. But here is the other side of that coin, and it is a side that deserves equal airtime. When a single private entity, one family, one corporation, one government-backed conglomerate controls land the size of a sovereign nation, what does that actually mean for everyone else? For the communities that used to live on that land? For the ecosystems that existed there long before the first fence post was ever driven into the ground? For the water tables that feed not just the ranch but entire regions downstream? These are not hypothetical questions. They are happening right now on the very ranches you are watching this video to learn about. Let's start with the land itself. The world's largest ranches didn't appear out of empty wilderness. In almost every case, in Australia, in North America, in South America, in Africa, the land that became these mega ranches was land that already belonged to someone. Indigenous communities across Australia's outback had lived on, managed and maintained deep spiritual and practical relationships with the land that is now Anna Creek Station and properties like it for over 60,000 years. 60,000 years. That is not a footnote. That is one of the longest continuous human relationships with a landscape in the history of our species. And in many cases, that relationship was severed, violently, legally, and permanently to make room for cattle. In South America, the story rhymes painfully. The Patagonian ranches that will appear later on this list were carved from territories belonging to indigenous Mapuche and Tehuelche communities, displaced during the colonial expansion of the 19th century. The legal frameworks that enabled those land grabs are still contested today, in courtrooms, in protests, in international human rights forums. The fences that define these ranches don't just mark property boundaries. In many communities, they mark the boundary between what was and what was taken. This is not an argument that these ranches should not exist. It is an argument that their existence carries a weight that the sheer spectacle of their scale can make easy to ignore. Now let's talk about water. A ranch covering millions of acres in an arid or semi-arid environment is at its core a water consumption machine. The cattle need it. The pastures need it. The processing facilities need it. The workers need it. And in environments where water is already scarce, which describes virtually every location on this list, the demands of a mega ranch operation can have cascading consequences for every living thing in the surrounding region. In parts of outback Australia, bore water extraction by large pastoral stations has measurably lowered the water table over decades, affecting native vegetation, wildlife populations, and the water security of smaller communities that depend on the same underground aquifers. In northern China, the expansion of large-scale pastoral zones has been linked to the degradation of wetland ecosystems that once served as critical habitat for migratory bird species. In the American West, water rights disputes between mega ranches and downstream agricultural communities have been escalating for years, and climate change is making those disputes more frequent and more ferocious with every passing season. Water, it turns out, doesn't respect fence lines. And then there is the question of consolidation. When land concentrates in fewer and fewer hands, when the gap between the largest landowner and the average citizen grows to the point where it can be measured in entire countries, something fundamental shifts in the relationship between people and the land they live on. Rural communities that once supported dozens of small family operations find themselves economically dependent on a single mega ranch that employs a fraction of the workforce that the same land once supported. Local ecosystems that once sustained diverse agricultural practices become monocultures, optimized for a single product, a single market, a single bottom line. This is not inevitable. And here is where the story gets genuinely hopeful, because some of the ranches on this list are actively wrestling with these questions and finding answers that point toward a different kind of future. Conservation ranching models that prioritize biodiversity alongside beef production. Indigenous land co-management agreements that restore traditional custodianship over portions of historic territory. Regenerative grazing practices that rebuild soil health instead of stripping it. Water management innovations that reduce consumption while maintaining productivity. The mega ranch does not have to be a story of extraction and consolidation alone. In the right hands, at the right scale, with the right values embedded in its operations, it can be something far more interesting than that. It can be a model, a laboratory, a proof of concept for what human beings and vast landscapes can build together, rather than what one can take from the other. But that future is not guaranteed. It has to be chosen. Deliberately. repeatedly, at every scale from the boardroom to the fence line. So keep that in mind as we return to the countdown, because the ranches still to come on this list are not just records waiting to be broken, they are choices waiting to be understood. Let's continue. You stayed through the hard conversation. Good. Because now you get something most videos about big ranches never talk about. Not the acreage, not the cattle counts, not the satellite imagery or the helicopter musters, though all of that is coming back as we continue the countdown. What you're about to get is the thing that actually determines whether a ranch this size survives or collapses. The invisible architecture behind the spectacle, the system underneath the system. The reason why two ranches of identical size in identical terrain with identical cattle numbers can produce completely opposite outcomes, one thriving for generations, one bankrupted within a decade. It comes down to three things, three principles that the most successful mega ranch operators on Earth have figured out, often the hard way, and that most people watching videos about big ranches never hear about. Think of these as the secret operating system of the world's greatest ranches. Here is something that will permanently change how you look at any ranch, anywhere, at any size. Grass is not a static resource. It is a living clock. And every single decision made on a mega ranch, where the cattle go, how long they stay, when they move, how many are in any given area at any given time, is ultimately a decision about how to read that clock correctly. The science behind this is called holistic planned grazing, a management framework developed largely by Zimbabwean ecologist Alan Savory, whose research has influenced ranching operations on every inhabited continent. The core insight is deceptively simple. Grasslands evolved alongside massive, constantly moving herds of grazing animals. The grass needs to be grazed, intensely, briefly, and then left alone to recover. Mimic that pattern, and the land thrives. Ignore it, and you get desertification. The slow, irreversible conversion of productive grassland into bare, compacted, biologically dead earth. On a ranch covering millions of acres, getting the grass clock right is an almost incomprehensibly complex logistical challenge. You are essentially choreographing the movement of hundreds of thousands of animals across a landscape the size of a small country in response to rainfall patterns, seasonal grass growth cycles, soil moisture readings, and satellite vegetation density maps, all simultaneously, all in real time. The ranchers that master this don't just maintain their land. They improve it. Year after year, decade after decade, their soil gets deeper, their grass gets denser, their water retention increases. They are, in the truest sense, farming the ecosystem itself, not just the cattle that live within it. The ranchers that get it wrong, within a generation, their most productive land looks like a parking lot. This one will surprise you. On virtually every high-performing mega ranch on Earth, the top 20% of the cattle herd generates approximately 80% of the total productive value of the operation. That's not a guess or a rough approximation. It is a consistently observed pattern, backed by decades of livestock performance data that has completely transformed how the best ranch managers in the world think about herd management. What this means in practice is that the single most important skill in mega ranch management isn't land management, water management, or even logistics. It's genetic selection. The relentless, data-driven, generationally patient process of identifying which animals are the most efficient converters of grass into weight gain, which bloodlines produce the most resilient offspring in harsh climates, and which animals are quietly dragging the performance of the entire herd downward. On a ranch with 100,000 cattle, the difference between a herd optimized through disciplined genetic selection and one that isn't can translate to tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue. Not from running more cattle, not from acquiring more land, simply from understanding which animals are worth keeping and having the discipline to make the hard calls on the ones that aren't. The best ranch managers in the world are, at their core, data scientists who happen to work outdoors. They track individual animal performance across years and decades. They cross-reference bloodline records with climate data, pasture performance maps, and market price forecasts. They make breeding decisions today that will determine the productivity of the herd 15 years from now. That is not cowboy romanticism. That is precision science at continental scale. The third secret has nothing to do with grass or genetics. It has to do with people. Here is a reality that every operator of a mega ranch eventually confronts, usually painfully. You can have the best land on Earth. You can have the most genetically superior herd ever assembled. You can have satellite systems, drone fleets, AI-assisted grazing models, and a water infrastructure that would make a civil engineer weep with admiration. And you can still lose everything if you cannot hold on to your people. The single most underestimated challenge in mega ranch management is human retention, attracting skilled workers to locations that are by definition extraordinarily remote, keeping them there year after year in conditions that test physical endurance, mental resilience, and personal sacrifice in ways that most careers never demand. Building a culture, a genuine, functional, loyal organizational culture across a workforce spread over millions of acres, where the nearest colleague might be a 2-hour drive away. The ranches that solve this problem don't just pay competitive wages, though they do that too. They build communities. They invest in housing, schooling, healthcare, and social infrastructure on the property itself. They create a sense of identity, a pride of place so strong that workers don't just do a job. They belong to something. The invisible fence is the one you build around your people. And on the world's biggest ranches, it is every bit as critical as the one you build around your cattle. These 3 secrets, the grass clock, the 80-20 animal rule, and the invisible fence, are the hidden architecture beneath every great ranch on this list. As we return to the countdown and reveal the 5 biggest ranches still to come, watch for these principles at work in every operation we profile. Because now that you know what to look for, you'll see them everywhere. And the ranches at the very top of this list? The ones that have held on to millions of acres for generations through droughts and floods and market crashes and climate shifts. They didn't survive by accident. They mastered all 3. If this story opened your eyes to the scale of our world, don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe to the Anatolian Peasants Farmers for more powerful stories that reshape how you see land, power, and history. Join us, stay curious, and be part of a growing community discovering the extraordinary hidden in plain sight.